Hi, I'm Paige Morgan,
And I'm Sarah Kremen-Hicks.
and this is the first podcast for our workshop series, Demystifying the Digital Humanities, sponsored by the Simpson Center for the Humanities at the University of Washington and the UW Textual Studies Department.
These are the slides from our first session, which was on October 13th. We just wanted to give you a little background on them, so here we are recording our very own voices. Our first session focused on what we've identified as the ethos and the values that are important to digital humanities. That's what we'll be going through today.
And just before we get started, if you haven't yet taken our DH profile quiz, it's really just an icebreaker, not meant as a formal classification, but I created it in order to get people thinking about their own processes and preferences and how they might integrate those into future study as digital humanists. All right, let's get started. So, there's a lot of discussion, even in the digital humanities community, about how to define digital humanities, and there's not a lot of agreement. So some people might say that you could define it according to when it began, and many digital humanists agree that one of the key early moments was in 1951 when Father Roberto Busa created an electronic concordance for the works of Thomas Aquinas. So that's one way of defining it. I could also try to define it by its stability, or really, its lack thereof. It's always changing. I could add to that and say that it is self-conscious in wanting to change constantly, which is to say that people who identify as digital humanists are often actively trying to change what they're doing and change the way that they pursue questions and answers. And of course, I could also define it according to its friction with traditional, or what some people call analog humanities, and talk about things that digital humanists do that traditional humanists sometimes frown upon, or the reverse. I don't find any of those satisfying. So, here's what other people say. I like to say that digital humanities is just one method for doing humanistic enquiry. It's a term of tactical convenience. It's an unfortunate neologism. Or, you can say that digital humanities is the thing practiced by people who self-identify as digital humanists. That puts the focus on what people are doing, and acknowledges the fact that really the field has a name because we needed a name in order to keep doing these things. So, because this field is so much about what people do, when Sarah and I put this workshop together, we thought that it would be more helpful to focus on the values and the ethos behind what people are doing, rather than try to teach our participants any one particular skill or practice. So, that said, let me turn this over to Sarah to give you those values.
Right, so we identified 10 key values. These are, I feel like I should say, not terms that we're taking as values from the larger DH community as established terminology. This is something that Paige and I came up with. But I do think that they're emblematic of a lot of DH work.
And also I think that people in the larger DH community do often use these terms.
Absolutely. So, DH values open source. We want both process and product to be available to everyone. It's often this is seen as in contrast to analog humanities and the very closed source publishing methods that happen there. So DH is in some ways looking for an alternative to that, a solution to that. DH Values DIY, do it yourself. Rather than saying, I have this great idea for a project and I need to find someone to do the coding for me, or I need to find someone to put it together for me, DH says, well, okay, go ahead, have at it. Iterative development. What this means is rather than waiting until you have a completed project that is shiny and never going to be changed again.
Or a perfect essay.
Yes, or a perfect essay. Really, this should be familiar because this is how we write too. That you put your process, you make your process transparent, and that you put up your project in stages. So you'll have something that's very bare bones to begin with, and what iterative development allows you to do is to get feedback on your project in all of its stages, and it allows you to keep working on it both in terms of what the sorts of feedback you've gotten, and it allows you to have discrete steps, and again to serve transparency. Autodidacticism, this is very similar to DIY, that if you want to do something and you don't know how, then go out and figure it out. If you want to build a database, then, learn how to build a database. That's great.
And one of the nice things about the DH community is really how supportive people are as you're learning all this stuff.
Definitely. DH people would love to talk to you and would love to hear what you're doing and give you some advice on it. And they're all very friendly. So go talk to them. Public scholarship and peer review. Again, these are all tied in together. So we've talked about this in terms of open source and iterative development already. That we don't want to hide DH projects behind paywalls. That's not that doesn't serve the sort of core DH ethos. So we want things to be available to the public in all of their iterations and in all of their, ugly and polished forms. And we want to be able to get feedback on that. But we also are looking for, and this is sort of constantly being kicked around and negotiated, how do we have a formal peer review process within these open source and iterative frameworks? And
how do we make public scholarship in a way that's actually sustainable, as opposed to a pipe dream utopia in which there is no economic system that can support it?
Exactly. And that's not solved. So collaboration. Again, this is particularly in literature, which is the field that Paige and I are both in, not something we're used to. DH really values working collaboratively, and again, this speaks to also the idea of public scholarship and feedback, and concurrent with that, dissemination, that your project should be available to everyone. If we can put things online, then great. Let everyone who can get online have at it. Process and product. DH really feels that the process is as valuable as the end product. That one of the things you'll see as you get further into the DH world is that people are constantly talking about their process. We feel that that's equally valuable, perhaps more so, than simply being presented with a finished product.
And I think that's important in part because one of the fears that sometimes people have about digital projects, which is that they are entirely unsustainable, that there will be a day, probably not too long, when your program, whatever it is, won't work because it's on too old of a software system. Talking about process really helps deal with this because it helps us look at how people handled a particular problem years earlier. And often, even if the software has changed dramatically, there are aspects of the process that actually do carry over and are still valuable even years later.
And I think, too, the focus on process also is really useful when you're starting out in DH because it lets you... So much of DH work is about displaying everything warts and all. And I think that as someone who's just starting out as a digital humanist, being able to see that everyone's process has horrible days and everyone has to go back and start from scratch when something's not working, is really, really useful. So, look at this not as an extra step, but rather as an entry point and something that can be both valuable and welcoming.
And that leads really nicely into
failure. Failure happens a lot, and in DH we like to talk about it. We like to look at what we can learn from it, but also I think there's an element of just sometimes it doesn't work and you just need to talk it through. So failure is valuable both in what we can learn from it and just in acknowledging that sometimes things don't work. And our last point is ad hoc or agility. I tend to use them interchangeably, but the idea that you should be flexible enough to... You start out with a project plan. DH is not about let's just do things and see what happens. We do have a project plan, but you need to be flexible enough to be able to change that plan once you see what's working and what's failing. So as I said, all of these values kind of bleed into one another. And those are the 10 that we identified as the major values.
Okay. So what we can do with this series of workshops, and I'll get into what we can do with these slides as well, we can allow you to begin charting your own course as a digital humanist. We think that understanding the values and the way that people go about learning within this field is really key to getting started, and it's something that other people who we've talked with in the course of planning this workshop have said as well. Likewise, we think that if you don't know the ethos and the values behind DH, then the field looks like a field where the only way to get started doing stuff is to learn programming languages. And if you're in a PhD program or any sort of graduate program in the humanities and you're teaching and maybe dealing with the rest of your life, that looks really unmanageable. But in fact, there's a whole lot more variety in the way that people do digital humanities. And so this whole year-long series is going to explore that more, and you'll see that more in the next slides for future presentations. Okay, moving on here. Providing necessary background and vocabulary. One of the things we spend a lot of time thinking about are the terminology that DH people just toss around very casually, that are kind of impenetrable to people outside of the field, and that isn't their fault, so we're going to try and clarify as much as we can. And note, if you're reading this on our website, there are links you can look at to see our glossary as it updates throughout the year. Make the digital humanities a safer and less intimidating space for experimenting. I think a lot of what I've just said kind of explains why DH can be an intimidating field, and why a series of workshops from our angle is needed.
One of the things that this speaks to, too, was our concern that because the digital humanities is so much about try it out and see what happens, you want to do something great, let's figure out how to do it. That can, despite how freeing that can be, that there's a certain threshold that you need to get to before you feel comfortable just messing around. And what we're trying to do is get you to that threshold where you can just mess around, at which point it becomes really, really fun.
Right. Of course, it's a lot different from the methodologies that you may have been trained in if you haven't been trained as a digital humanist. And finally, attempt to build a DH cohort at the UW, which happily, thanks to our participants, we seem to be off to a roaring start so far. If you're watching this from outside, though, we're doing as much as we can to try and adapt the workshops for this format. If there's something that we miss or that you'd really like to see, then get in touch with us and we'll see whether we can make it happen. We might not be able to, we might fail, but
we'll tell you all about how we fail.
And we will fail better and better every time we try. So, what we can't do, of course, is make you into a digital humanist. Hey, look, there's my the rest of my PowerPoint slide. Not even in 6 sessions. It can't be done. Nor really do we want to force anyone to enter the digital humanities unless it's something that they really want to do.
I think also thinking about the digital humanities as a monolithic field which one enters is really quite limiting. What we hope to offer you is a number of ways that you might use digital humanities methodology within your own field. So to say that we're turning you into digital humanists is a bit of a misnomer in any case.
Right. Happily, though, if what we've been saying about get in there and experiment and embrace your failures is the least bit intimidating, which it certainly would have been to me, don't worry. You cannot break the internet just by experimenting. You also can't break your career. Well, maybe you could.
It would take a supreme effort.
If you break your career, then let us know. We're sure we'd be very impressed. We'd like to see that. Okay, so while you admire Boromir, let's recap, because this is essentially the end of our major content for this first session, what we can present in the slides. In the rest of the workshop, we asked our participants to look at several different websites from around the internets. And you can go to those as well. We put them in, we created six groups of people, so the Twitter websites that are up there are really meant to be looked at in conjunction with each other, but you can look at one of these, you can go to town and look at them all. It's entirely up to you. Do what your schedule allows. And as our participants looked at the websites, we asked them to consider a few questions. Namely, what you see as the site maker's priorities? Which of the values from the previous list do you see in operation? What sort of user and usage are the site makers imagining the site will have? What aspects, if any, aren't working well? And is there anything else that stands out or raises questions for you? I think what I'd say about that last question is that if there is something that stands out to you, then it's worth thinking about why, and figuring out what you're responding to there, whether your response is positive or negative, both as increasing your familiarity with the field and as getting inspiration, potentially, for what you might do in the future.
So this exercise was really about looking at the values and the ethos that we've established earlier on in this slideshow, and seeing those in action. So the move from theory to practice really
is important.
Yes.
All right, I think we're almost at the end of this thing. Let's see. Oh, hey, our resources for further training. We wouldn't want to leave you without further things to do.
That would be tragic.
That would. One of the things we thought about a lot in putting this together was how to find a balance between dumping the internet onto our students' heads versus giving them too little to do, or giving them a set, telling them to go Google it, because Google's like a fire hose and it's hard to know, especially when you're starting out, what makes a good resource and what makes a bad resource. So let's just quickly talk through these. Sarah, do you want to tell people about DHSI?
I would love to tell people about DHSI. DHSI is the Digital Humanities Summer Institute. It's in Victoria in Canada. It's amazing. It is a week-long nerd summer camp. It's quite possibly the most fun I had all summer, and I had quite a good summer. So DHSI is also taking registrations for their 2013 sessions now. So what you do is you go to their website, which we've handily provided for you right there. Check out their offerings. There are a ton of offerings this year. I think there are 20-some classes. DHSI lets you participate in a single week-long class, so you pick one of the tracks. They have things that are related to specific tools. They have things that are more broad overviews of particular subset of the field, in whatever way we're defining that.
Could be pedagogy, could be physical computing, so making things with 3D printers.
You can look at GIS and mapping. You can look at it's got everything. It has all the things, and it's wonderful. So you should totally go sign up for DHSI. They also offer scholarships, which you can apply for, and you should do that now, right now, after we finish talking. Okay, so DHWI is new this year. That's the Digital Humanities Winter Institute. That's in Maryland at MITH, which is a fairly well-known digital humanities center. This is their first year, 2013 rather, January 2013 will be their first year. So I can't tell you much about them other than that they exist. They are a counterpart to DHSI.
And they work in about the same way.
Yeah, they have fewer course offerings, but that's just because they're new, and I imagine that will expand as time goes on.
So if you're curious about seeing MITH, and meeting more of the East Coast DHers, then that's a great way to do it. Another good way would be to sign up for the TEI seminars at Brown University in Providence, Rhode Island. These happen mostly during the summer months and early fall, so you'll want to keep an eye on their website, though it looks like they may be starting to have them during the rest of the year. We'll keep you posted if you're in our seminar. The great thing about these is that you get a very good, basic and intensive introduction to using the TEI, that's Text Encoding Initiative language, and it's very comfortable and friendly, and if you're a graduate student, then you can get up to $900 travel funding as to compensate your expenses for getting over there, so totally worth checking out. If you don't feel like traveling, you can check out any of the UW Library's workshops. These change throughout the year, and they're really wide-ranging. They cover everything from programming languages like JavaScript and CSS and HTML, to covering working with Photoshop and Adobe InDesign. They even have workshops on teaching you how to use some of the new tools that UW has created for digital pedagogy. So check the schedule because they rotate throughout the year in terms of what's available.
Skill Crush is something we mentioned in the workshops if you were there. It's an email list that you can sign up for. Every morning you get a new tech term showing up in your inbox. They also have some interviews with people, digital humanists, coders, things like that. But the really valuable thing is just sort of building your vocabulary that way. It's like a page-a-day calendar that comes through your email.
And that way you feel less intimidated the next time you're having a conversation with people who throw around crazy terms. You too could learn what camel case means. You could also ask me and I'd tell you.
What does camel case mean, Paige?
Camel case is if you've ever seen WordPress, the way that WordPress is generally capital and then lowercase, 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 and then another capital without any spaces in there. So that the capitals end up like the humps of a camel, and coders call that camel case, and it's the subject of controversy, but more on that another time.
We also have fairly juvenile senses of humor.
So Prof Hacker is just a blog column in the Chronicle of Higher Education. It's free, not paywalled, which is one great thing about it, but it's written by a variety of people, many of them who have DH leanings. Some of them would say they're full digital humanists, some of them just use some DH tools occasionally. And it covers everything from teaching to productivity to mental health as an academic in a terrible job climate.
One of the great things about Prof Hacker is that they do their weekly roundup posts, so you can kind of see what are the big stories that happened this week. They also will often do kind of top 5 posts, which are quite often about top 5 tools and resources. I've found a number of programs and tools that I use based on the Clearly not an enunciation tool, but Prof. Hacker posts useful 5 things, yes.
And finally, since I think that our ability to speak clearly and publicly is just about at an end, if you're interested in digital humanities and you know that digital humanists use Twitter, but Twitter seems overwhelming, check the address that we've provided. That'll take you to a list of people who I follow, many of whom are doing digital humanities stuff. So you can get a sense of the things that they talk about, and you're guaranteed that the subject matter will be focused on digital humanities. It'll also contain other stuff as well, and that's, to preview our next workshop, something that we'll be talking about, the way that you balance between talking about your academic life and your academic work, and about stuff that is completely non-academic, like what your cat ate for breakfast.
I would argue that cats are actually academic at this point.
I think that's fair. Okay, so to wrap up, we would really like to thank our sponsors for this, without whom these workshops would not have been possible at all. The Simpson Center for the Humanities and the UW Textual Studies program. And if you visit our website, there are links to both of their pages on the site. And let's see, I think that really that's about it. So thanks
everyone
very much. We hope this was helpful, and we look forward to seeing you and talking with you more.
Bye.
Bye.